Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Hanson, and good afternoon, everybody who is in the screen and outside in the future. In this talk, we want to present some projects and also a work method of research about applied history. We work in the northwest of Galicia about agricultural history, and Galicia is in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, and we research in this way since 40 years ago, more or less. We have projects that there are framed in the context of open science nowadays, and we have a very large teams working from a interdisciplinary perspective. In our case, we come from history, we are historians, this is our field, but try to transcend since the beginning in another disciplinary boundaries in our work. And we look for a not just multidisciplinary, even transdisciplinary way of research. Next one, please. To understand these projects properly, we would like to begin by presenting the evolution of our group of research, which already has a long research trajectory. The group's origin date back to the early 80s. It begins in that historical moment as a project of reconstruction of agrarian past of Galicia, this country of the northwest of Spain. A research centered on classical themes of rural history, liberal revolution, forest history, technological change in contemporary agriculture, commons. This was very important since the beginning. But these topics have diversified over time with the work of a group that already has 3 generations, even 4 generations of seniors and 3 generations of senior researchers and a new generation of researchers just now. 4 generations at the end. In this time, we introduce new questions and new themes, and we accumulate and we realize that we accumulate a very big collective knowledge about rural history. Galician one, but since a long time ago, you know that this is also European and universal rural history. We developed near that 50 PhD since 1982, and we incorporate topics as social history of the rural world, the study of dictatorship, and the repression and genocide in rural world, social and gender inequalities or environmental history, and even a very important field about social agrarian mobilization in history. We can continue, David. Our interest in applied history started at the beginning of the last decade, around 2010, when we start to work in a network in agroecology with another colleagues from economic history, agrarian sociology and economy, ecological economics, agronomy, and also forestry, engineers or scholars. Then, in this net between these years until 2018, we work in a singular way, just in order to understand what can we do for rural world. We know a lot of questions. We have a lot of knowledge, but we don't look for a quickly transference. We employ a lot of time in order to look for a way of transfer, look for a way of participatory research in order to understand not only our knowledge, even the peasants, traditional and new, and farmers' new knowledge. And was in this time when we define a way of participatory action research in history. We can continue, David. Since 2018, Instagram has been involved also in the creation of a new research institute in which mission is essential open science and knowledge co-creation. Our experience in Revolta Network was very important for this, and most of that group of research were involved also in this new project of a center, Inter-University Research Center for Atlantic Cultural Landscape, that have a very defined and discussed scientific agenda. We defined our work since a lot of points of view: sociology, economy, history, history of art, tourism, engineering, forestry, agronomy, even biology, and so on, since these 5 points, since these 5 fields of research. In every world landscape, we can find people living or people working. In Europe and in European history, and most in Atlantic European history, and most in Galician history, every landscape was built by people, by the work of a lot of generations of farmers and peasants. All of these landscapes must be governed. There is a kind of social participation in landscape governance. There is commons. The commons are very important in Galicia and north of Portugal, or in Sweden, or in Scotland. In Galicia represent the 23% of all our territory, have a communal way of management. But there is also a governance of the municipality, of the state, of different administrations, even Europe. Then the question of how landscape is governed, landscape that produce and landscape with people, is very important. And we have a very old history in Europe, and mostly in some parts of Atlantic Europe that we have not worked since Napoleonic ones. Then we have a very important heritage. And this is very important to understand the landscape and the use of the landscape. And in the same way, there is another field that we defined, because all the European landscapes are visited, and tourism is a very important point to understand how the landscape evolution and the landscape future even. A seguinte. And in this way, and I am going to finish my presentation, we have different lines of research. Most of them, or I mean all of them, thinking in a cooperative way between different researchers. Our center we are in this moment 100 of senior researchers involved in the center in this kind of questions. And most of these research lines have in the 5 different fields are defined in order to involve people of the communities and to develop a participatory way of research in the frame of open science. And I think that David can continue now with the projects itself. Okay?
Okay. Thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you also from my part for the invitation. Well, after developing our trajectory and our concept of open science and transfer, and before explaining several of the examples that we are working on, I will explain briefly some features of the evolution of the agricultural system of Galicia, because we think that our concept of participatory action research is related with our understanding of the past of rural in Galicia. So. Very briefly, we will explain the defining features of the present organic agrarian system, and then we will see the changes during the last decades linked to the process of industrialization of agriculture, because we think that understanding these changes will enable us to assess properly the current problems of the rural environment in Galicia where our projects operate. The first that we need to say that we are working on Galicia, that is in northwest Spain, is an Atlantic region in a Mediterranean country, but Spain is mainly Mediterranean, but Galicia is Atlantic, and is in a small scale agricultural region, as you can see in this photo of aerial photo of 1956, and first thing to note about Galician agriculture is this characteristic of an Atlantic agriculture. And there are important differences with the predominant agricultural model in Spain, typical of Mediterranean soil or climatic conditions. This characteristic of an Atlantic agriculture means that Galicia has a much higher net primary productivity. We can see here some of the main data in 1922. What is one of the last points of organic agrarian agriculture in Galicia in the 20th century? The cropland produced 4.3 tons of dry matter by hectare, and by comparison, in the same year in Spain, produce only 1.5 tons by hectare. This means that we are talking of a agrarian system close to other Atlantic agricultures, as in England, in Belgium, in Atlantic France, and so on. And in addition to this high productivity of the land, Galicia also experiences an early process of livestock specialization since 18th and 19th centuries. But unlike the recent industrialization of agriculture, this livestock specialization was compatible with small-scale multifunctional agriculture. So the questions relevant for us are how this high productivity could be maintained. How could this agrarian system work? As you can see in the table, only a small part of the Galician landscape was dedicated to crops. Almost 2/3 of the territory was uncultivated. But uncultivated does not mean unmanaged. On the contrary, intensive land use was necessary to transfer nutrients for farmland to maintain this high productivity. And this is important because until very recently, we cannot talk in Galicia, we cannot talk of woodlands or forest in the way that we talk today. In fact, in Galician language or in Spanish language, we have a term that have not a proper translation in English, that is the term monte. Monte means a landscape that can be used in a multifunctional way, of course forest, but also human food through, for example, shifting cultivation, animal feed, litter for manure to maintain the high fertility, firewood, timber, stones for building, etc., etc. This agroecological diversity, in productive terms, was also combined with a high institutional diversity, in the sense that Elinor Ostrom has developed. And this institutional diversity made possible the stability of the system, but also made possible changes when necessary. And it's important to understand that we are talking about a territory with a high population density. The Mediterranean Spain has a comparative lower population density, but Galicia has a high population density since 17th century. And it's a territory where small peasant exploitation predominated, and with a lower level of inequality than in Mediterranean Spain. This not means that there is not inequality, but it's lower than in Mediterranean Spain. Peasant land ownership was also predominant, and this is true even today. But this peasant ownership of crops in Galicia is historically combined with a very important presence of communal property, which in the mid-18th century occupied most of the territory. And despite the privatization and dispossession by the states in the 19th century and 20th century, even today, the commons, as Lourenzo told before, are quite relevant. We are talking about, we can see in this map, the 22% of the territory are commons, especially in the mid-south of Galicia. Several of the living labs we are working on are located precisely in communities with a significant presence of common land. How have the changes been seen the process of industrialization of agriculture? In Spain and Galicia, the industrialization of agriculture is a late process compared to the rest of Europe. It begins after the 1960s. This is because the impact of the Francoist dictatorship that has a big impact, especially in 40s and 50s. For the case of Galicia, we can note that this process involved the transition from a model of territorial organization of land sharing to a territorial organization of land expanding, or we can say, in other words, to articulated landscapes in agroecological mosaics, to landscapes completely dismantling. So the main consequences in the landscape of industrialization of agriculture has been the territorial disarticulation and rupture of the collective logics in agricultural communities. It should also be pointed out that the first decades of the industrialization process of agriculture took place under a dictatorial political regime. The collective capacity to respond by conflict, for example, to the development of the process of industrialization was therefore limited. And this is a very big difference with the rest of Europe. As the industrialization process develop, increasing the use of industrial inputs. Less biomass of the landscape itself was used to reproduce the biophysical forms, for example, land and livestock. And this means that the main change wasn't an increase in production. We can see in this graph the evolution of the domestic extraction of biomass in Galicia since 60s until today, and we can see that it's not a big increase, but the idea was maximizing market flows of biomass. We can see here a diminution of the biomass devoted to reproduce the biochemical cycles of agroecosystems, and this means that we need to use industrial inputs to maintain the production in the future. So the first idea about industrialization is the intensification. And the second feature of the industrialization process was a production specialization. So we can talk two analytically separated processes, one of intensification, another of specialization. In the case of Galicia, this was there was a double specialization process as a result of the territorial breakup. A first route of specialization was in livestock, mainly cows, for milk production. This means a livestock model that has increased its dependence on the market with the import of feed, for example, to maintain the cows. This means that Galician peasants less to use the landscape to feed the cows and starting to import feed to feed the cows. But is it very important because the adoption of this livestock specialization, which was not dependent on the territory, allowed a second specialization in intensive forestry production of market goods. First, from pines, and second, later, of eucalyptus. That is today the more relevant forest area in Galicia is of eucalyptus. It also leads to the abandonment of part of the territory. This process of specialization led, therefore, not to a renaturalization or a rewilding, but to the destruction of the agroecosystems mosaics typical of organic agriculture and to a strong environmental degradation. Alongside the consequences for the production system, we must also mention the socioeconomic consequences. The industrialization model of agriculture cannot be understood as an economic success. Its social impact, if its social impact is analyzed. Although industrialization allowed the creation of a group of profitable and successful farms, this happened at the cost of a process of agricultural abandonment and very strong rural depopulation. The increase in inputs, in industrial inputs, so the increase in expenses is linked to a fall in agricultural income, which could be only compensated by the destruction of jobs and the disappearance of many farms. This process of agrarian change has contributed to territorial dismantling. There are fewer people living in rural areas, but above all, there are fewer people working in rural areas. In addition, the knowledge required to work an industrial farm has very little to do with the peasant knowledge of organic farming. Although some of the local knowledge accumulated over generation is still alive in Galicia, especially over older people, we are at risk of its disappearance. For this reason, it's important to develop projects that work on the recovery and systematization of this local knowledge, not for museums, but for their usefulness in the agroecological transition. Well, one of the main consequences of these processes in the territory is that of forest fires. This have become a recurring problem since the 70s, which has been aggravated by climate change, but whose main historical explanation is the industrialization model of agriculture in Galicia and Spain. The origin of the problem of fires is in the forest model of the Francoist dictatorship, continued in democracy, to promote a process of reforestation in monoculture forest as raw material for industry. And this process was carried out against the local communities, contributing to the breakdown of the balances of previous agro-silvopastoral systems. The outbreak of the forest fires problem led to the construction of a firefighting system that consumes more resources every year, but has not stopped fires. Indeed, with the acceleration of climate change, the big forests are now much greater. As an example, we can say that although the resources spent on extinction this year in 2025, the data are not in the graph. We have the second worst year in forest fire since 1989 in the year 2025. Well, this is very briefly an abstract of our knowledge at historical changes in Galician agriculture, and through this I will show some of the examples. But first, I explain what is our approach to applied history research. This approach is based on historical knowledge, is based and are not reluctant to develop basic research projects in competitive convocatories as Horizon in Europe and other ones, but it aims to use this academic knowledge to generate transfer. But our hypothesis is that historical knowledge can help the development of local agroecological transition projects from 4 arguments. The first of these arguments is that our work demonstrates that communities knew how to manage the territory in a sustainable way. Although some of this knowledge is now present only in historical sources or in the memory of the elders. Second, we have the method to reconstruct this knowledge through both oral history and written record. Third, this work allows us to validate this knowledge and, more important, strengthen the collective identity of the communities with a positive identification with the past of the community. And this positive identification works very well against negative narratives imposed from outside. For example, the very strong idea of peasant backwardness that is generalized in all Europe, but especially strong in the case of Galicia. So we will present some of the projects that we are, in the last part of the presentation, that we are developed in recent years from this perspective. The first of them is Eolementa Comereo, is a project to create a participatory food strategy in the border region between Galicia and Asturias. This project starts with the idea that the local agri-food systems are built historically. And it also assumes that despite the dominant nature of agricultural system today, for example, the ideas of food regimes and the industrial food regime that is dominant today. It also assumes that despite this dominant nature of agro-industrial regimes, it is possible to take advantage of this historical trajectory to develop local transition projects to local agri-food systems. The project, initially led by Istagra and funded through calls from the Carasso Foundation, that is a very big relevant foundation in projects in agroecology in France and in Spain, sought to articulate local productive initiatives, proximity marketing experiences, consumers and public authorities, mainly the municipalities of the region. You can see here the map and the 4 municipalities in Galicia and the 5 municipalities in Asturias. The idea is to articulate these actors in the design of a local food strategy from a participatory way. The project was successful from a point of view, not only because the level of involvement of these actors in the strategy design, but also because after the completion of the funded projects, the strategy continues with local leadership by municipalities and only with external support from our part. The success of the problem that we are not now leading the project, and this is very important, very relevant for us in terms of participatory projects. The second project is still in an initial phase and represents a more ambitious continuation of the previous project. The aim is to ambition because it involved more people, not because the other project was not ambitious. The aim is to build a local agri-food system in Galicia's third largest city, Santiago de Compostela, also the capital of the region, with 100,000 inhabitants. So it's a very big challenge. And we started from an argument that is not very usual in Spain or in Europe. The local market of Santiago, we see a photo of the building, is still maintained as a food space of proximity. And this is not the case in many local markets in big cities in Spain and in Europe that are now a space for tourism and gastronomy. From this argument, we explore the possibilities of the productive environment of the region of Santiago to meet the demand for food in the city with locally produced food and organically produced food. The response was positive. The actors agree with the idea, and we are now currently exploring complementary funding possibilities to continue with these projects, but with the participation of the Santiago de Compostela municipality. Then the third and the last project we want to present is the Barbanza Ecosocial Lab. That this is a participatory action research project. This is the biggest transfer project that we are working now. And this is a participatory action research project that we are developing with local communities about common management of landscapes. It's a project that this is currently alive and is functioning as a real living lab. The project started as a collaboration between the RIA Foundation, that this is a foundation interested in local development, and Istagra. From an initial interest in assessing the potential of communities to provide ecosystem services, we developed a local knowledge gathering project, and the idea was to recover the local knowledge, and from this collection and systematization of local knowledge, we develop process of feedback and debate with the communities about possibilities for the future. From these processes and with the impetus of several communities, it has become a locally led project. The project is supported by various universities, not only University of Santiago and CISPAC, and rural development institution, but now is led by the communities themselves. And for us, it's also a sign of success, the idea that the communities lead the processes. The main objective is to initiate a process of agricultural transition towards a multifunctional management of the territory, which integrates livestock, forestry, agriculture, and social action. We can see here in this photo, two photos in the left, of the process of gathering knowledge with older people. You can see that there are collective dialogues between them, and in the right we can see one of the events that we developed for giving back of learnings to the communities, but also is a debate on the future of these rural areas to support ongoing local initiatives or to promote new ones. The question is why these communities place so much emphasis on multifunctional management. For local communities, the main problem is forest fires, and this link with our work in historical evolution of Galician agriculture that we present before. And for these communities, forest fires is perhaps the most important today, since it put at risk the economic viability of their communal lands, but also put at risk the security of their homes and families. And for this reason, several communities have initiated transition processes in attempt to abandon monoculture forestry and to introduce a new series of activities that will make possible to advance multifunctionality. So one of our objectives is to support these transition processes. A particular clear example is that of the communities of municipality of Rianxo that were affected by forest fires in 2006 and 2019, and we can see in the data the impact of these forest fires. Rianxo municipality have around 6,000 hectares, and the communals of Rianxo have around 2,000 hectares, and in the 2019 wildfires, 1,100 hectares burned. So this is a complete shock for the communities. After these fires, they decided to group together. They built an organization that is in Galician is Plataforma en Defensa do Monte. We can translate as Platform in Defense of the Territory, and integrate into Barbanza Ecosocial Lab. They call us, they decide to work with us, and they start a process of transition to a more multifunctional management that would allow fires not to become a problem of such magnitude. And to accompany these transition processes, we develop a project funded by the Spanish Biodiversity Foundation, which is funding the transition process, as well as work to develop participatory assessment and advisory methods with communities. What is our work, the part of our work in the project is this last topics. To the very end of the presentation, we can hear an example of a community, the Baroña Common Lands, that is very close to the Rianxo, that is a very well example of this multifunctional model. We can see here in the photos, this is a descriptive way to show this, but we have, of course, a more quantitative analysis of all of these things. We can see the wealth of the activities that this community develop. And so for the very end, I want to say that we start this project with the Laboratorio Ecosocial talking about environmental services, and we are not talking about agro-environmental services. That is similar, but it's not exactly the same, because in this agroecological environmental service or agro-environmental services, we are talking about not only of carbon sequestration or biodiversity. We are talking about this, of course, but we are talking about the social impact on the local communities that are absolutely necessary to provide these services. So to conclude, the examples we have presented, in our opinion, show the usefulness of applied history for agroecological transition in Europe, and also show the potential of local communities to develop these processes, but also show that they need a lot of support to carry them out from universities, from public policies, and so on. So thanks for your attention, and we finish now.